This video is a follow-on from the previous video on Chronicle's microservices framework, and in this example we will go into more detail on the Chronicle testing framework. As such, most of the rest of the project has been built in advance, and we will focus on building out the tests. For this example, we have chosen to build out an account balancer. So under main, we can see the first interface of transaction service with two method signatures of debit and credit. And secondly, the balance interface, where we have the account balance value. Next, let's see our two services. Firstly, the transaction service simple takes away our debit from our balance, and secondly, it adds our credit to our balance. Then, the run transaction service simple. This is here as an example to drive our core service. In the real world, this service would probably be integrated with a third-party system. It prints out our account balance, and the start method gets called upon startup. As you can see, we have input a few examples of credit and debit. Then let's take a look at our configuration file. As you can see, here we have the two queues of transaction and account balance, and here we've set up our two services, each with the correct input, output, and implementation class. Finally, let's see main. The line to point out here is the run all, as this is what runs our configuration file. Now, to demonstrate this running, we'll run main. It prints out 4 answers, so let's go back to run transaction service simple to see what we had. Here you can see that it initially printed out our credit of 600, then it subtracted our debit of 350, then added 40, and finally it subtracted 65. Now that we can see how it works, we'll focus on building out the test. In our resources folder, we're going to firstly build out the expected input and expected output YAML files. The reason for YAML files is because we use a YamlTester from Chronicle services. So, under balance and an in.yaml, let's firstly input something for credit, such as 400, and for debit, 150. In our out.yaml, we know that the first output should be that credit value of 400, and then our debit will be subtracted, so the second value should be 250. To run this test, let's go to balance test. Here you can see our YamlTester. It needs to be provided with 3 things: the directory to find our YAML files, the output, in this case balance, and finally a service, transaction service simple. As we said, we need to provide the directory in which to find our YAML files, so for this test it will be under test, balance. Now let's run this. When we run this, it runs without any errors. But let's see what would happen if we now change the input file and not the expected output. Now, when we run this again, we get this error, as the values do not match. As this was a small example, it would not be too much work to edit the expected output, but if we had a bigger example, it would be a lot of effort to change our out.yaml every time we change the in.yaml. If we are sure our test is running correctly, as it is here, there is a way to have our out.yaml automatically update. To do this, we click on our test and click on Edit Configurations. On this line, we need to add in -d regress.tests. Our in.yaml file still has the credit of 500, and if we open up our out.yaml file, it has 400. Now let's run this. We see that firstly there are no errors, and then the output is automatically updated. If we are adding in comments to our YAML files, then sometimes we may only want comments in one of the files, but not the other. One example would be if we had the comment add credit and subtract debit in our in.yaml file, but did not want this in the out.yaml file. To add this functionality, we go back into Edit Configurations, and this time we need to add -d tests.include.comments. And firstly, let's see what happens when we have equals false. When we run this, we see that the comment does not get printed over to the out.yaml file, which is what we want. For demonstration purposes, let's see what happens if we go in and edit this back to the default of true. Now, when we run this, we can see that the comment shows in both files. Of course, in our case, we want to go in and change this back to false. However, for our regress tests, we should now take this out so that our test is able to detect any future changes. Now let's try adding in another test. For this one, I want my program to stop if it can see that my account will go into negative, and for it to print an error message. So for example, in the in.yaml file under the neg balance folder, let's say my credit is 400, but my debit is 1000. Then, in the out.yaml file, the initial account balance of 400 should print. However, then we should see an account error of negative balance is prohibited, transaction rejected. To set this up, firstly I want to add an account error into my balance interface, which is a string message. Then I need to add an if statement to the transaction server simple, which checks if balance minus debit is less than 0, then we want that account error from before. In run transaction server simple, I want to then print out this account error message. In balance test, I need to make sure that I add in a test and add the directory with where to find the YAML files for this test. Finally, let's run this. As you can see, there are no errors, and so this test is also working. For more information about Chronicle services or our other products, email us at info@chronicle.software.